Welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, May 15th, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about the state of Maryland and last night's U.S. Senate primary as Prince George's County Executive Angela Alsobrooks defeated Representative David Trone from Maryland's 6th Congressional District here in one of the nation's most closely watched races, a very important race, one that was going to determine who was going to face off against Governor Larry Hogan this coming fall, this coming November election. Maryland at the very much spotlight of the mainstream media here after many different conversations have been had. Who is going to win this Democratic primary? As the polls predicted one thing, the results showed another, the money said one thing, the endorsement said another. It was a whiplash race that ultimately came down to the last final days of momentum that clearly Angela Alsobrooks had, and clearly Angela Alsobrooks won. Now, this is my home state. And so I made a video talking about it yesterday because for the first time in forever, my state was at a very interesting point with much national coverage in a way that we really haven't seen in years past. Maryland almost never has a competitive race, whether presidential, Senate, or gubernatorial. The last time was when Governor Larry Hogan decided to run for re-election in 2018, and even then he ended up winning by double digits. This race in particular serves as a unique point of interest because the Democratic primary served as sort of a proxy war and as a microcosm of the National Democratic Party and the influence of money versus endorsements and grassroots organizing in states like Maryland, in states with a heavy Democratic Party population, that where the elections almost always end at primary season. So in this video, we're going to be unpacking the Senate primary election results, what it means for the general election, and pretty much looking at all of the external influences in races like this one. We're going to take a look at open secrets and see the amount of money that was spent on the race here. We're going to take a look at the list of endorsements that Angela Alsobrooks and David Trone received in their election and why that might have made a difference as to who won versus didn't. We're also going to be unpacking the polls here and the accuracy or maybe inaccuracy of some of the things that we saw in the final stretch of the campaign season and the early months of the campaign season. But ultimately, Maryland, for the first time in a long time, serves to be a unique state that tells us a lot about national Democratic politics. And so let's get started by unpacking a very interesting county level result map here. This is my home state. I've been talking to you about it a lot, but the main takeaway is that Angela Alsobrooks ended up winning with 54% of the vote against David Trone's 41.9%. So it wasn't a particularly close race. 66% of the vote is in, and we expect that as more of the vote is counted, the margin really won't fluctuate too heavily. And so this is where we are right now, and this is where we likely will remain as all the votes are counted in. And you can see here that on the right, you find that there are a number of counties that are colored in blue and a number of counties that are colored in purple. And that's because different candidates won different parts of the state. And you see here that on the left side of the state, this entire section, I don't even want to call it a panhandle, but this entire section of Maryland here is purple. This entire side of the more eastern side of the state is also purple. Now this core area is blue. Now here's something that I think will make this more painstakingly obvious. This right side is amongst the most conservative and amongst the higher white population. Over here is David Trone's congressional district. And so David Trone, he pretty much locked down his district here. He won in his, Garrett County, 80%, Allegheny County, 80%, Washington County, 79%, Frederick County, 66%, Carroll County, 56%. He locked it down. He did very well in this part, except his home county, Montgomery County, where he lost to Angela Alsobrooks. Now, here's where the core constituency comes in. You look at this eastern side of Maryland, a big reason why you do see Democrats, like David Trone do well here is because they aren't as progressive. They aren't as leaning into, really anything outside of what they might be seeing in terms of advertisements because people don't visit this region of Maryland. People don't campaign in this part of Maryland. Why? Because in order to get here, you're either crossing the Bay Bridge right around here, or you're spending 3 hours when the entire Democratic population exists in this area, the Baltimore metro area, the DC metro area. This is where the votes are. And so when you look at counties like this one, Caroline County, a huge, check of land, you would obviously want to visit the state, but ultimately, David Trone and Alsobrooks 50-41. And so this is a close county in theory, but there were less than 1,000 votes. And so I look at that and I say, maybe this wasn't a good use of time if anyone was to visit it, and chances are nobody did. You also see it in Queen Anne's, you also see it in Cecil County. And so this area here is where you saw things like David Trone's influence with his pocketbook, his influence with, media markets that he'd already existed in before does well. This is where you saw Angela Alsobrooks do really well. In Baltimore area, Montgomery area, Prince George's area, her home county, this is what drove her to victory. Because you can see that although, David Trone was winning with 80% margins in some parts of the state, he still lost by 12 points. And that's because these parts of Maryland really turned out for Angela Alsobrooks. Another thing that I think you might find interesting is that there's a huge set of racial dynamics when it comes down to running in a Maryland primary as there is with a nationalized primary. You found it in 2008 when Barack Obama was running against Hillary Clinton. You found it again in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was running against Bernie Sanders, in the sense that you had minority voters, in particular black voters, backing candidates like Hillary Clinton and then Joe Biden in 2020 in a very, very, wide margin. And the same thing that you saw in 2008. Same thing you're seeing happen in states like Maryland, which again serve as a microcosm of the rest of the country. And so areas like Baltimore City, which have a very high black population in the Democratic primary, Angela Alsobrooks did exceptionally well. You also found it in Prince George's. You also found it in Montgomery. This is where you found Democrats doing well. And you found people like Angela Alsobrooks doing well as well. When I say Democrats do well here, I mean in general elections. And so you look at states like this. You look at Maryland. You look at other states too, Massachusetts. That's where you will find that there are very interesting primary results that can be indicative of the rest of the country and the rest of the Democratic Party. But it isn't just this. I think the county level dynamics that you find at play here, whether it's congressional district support, where the advertisements were done well, and where you found that minority voters really coalesced around Angela Alsobrooks, who, if elected, would be, I believe, alongside Lisa Blunt Rochester, they would double the amount of black women in the U.S. Senate, and would be the first time, actually, that two black women ever served in the U.S. Senate together. Angela Alsobrooks just would so happen to be the first black person ever elected to the U.S. Senate from the state of Maryland. Governor Wes Moore was actually the first black governor ever elected to the state of Maryland as well in 2022. And so you find here that this is something that really resonated well with minority voters. You found it as a top issue too, considering that Angela Alsobrooks, David Trone, more likely than not, would not have differentiated too dramatically when it comes down to who was voting on what issue. And so a lot of it also had to do with just simple representation, simple lived experiences, and a simple way of campaigning, where Angela Alsobrooks effectively marketed herself to groups of voters that David Trone just simply could not. And that's a failure on the side of the Trone campaign, and obviously a success on the side of the Alsobrooks campaign. But she was actually facing a lot higher odds than many of us understand. I think when you take a look at the amount of money that was funded into the race, it becomes apparent as to how this race, at initial glance, should have been a David Trone landslide. David Trone is a billionaire. He owns Total Wine and more, and anybody who knows the Total Wine knows that he's making a huge amount of money. He spent $60 million on this race. $60 million to win a Democratic primary that he ended up losing by roughly 12 points. Now, David Trone, when compared to Angela Alsobrooks on the money side of things, I think I mentioned this earlier on, it was roughly a 10-1 advantage. By the end of it, you ended up seeing it a little bit less than 10-1, but it was a huge sum of money, a huge sum of cash here that David Trone pumped into the race, and Angela Alsobrooks just simply couldn't keep up. Neither of them were fundraising juggernauts, and so both of them had to, in a way, find a way to source grassroots donations. David Trone couldn't do it, so he spent his own money on it, but Angela Alsobrooks did. But she only amassed roughly $5 to $7 million. It's not a super large amount, and she wasn't getting super large amounts of funding from super PACs or nationalized organizations that could have spent excessive amounts of funds on this state. She got $5 to $7 million, and that's all she had. And so what she did correctly wasn't that she spent excessive amounts of funds across the state. I mean, David Trone ads were running left and right in my hometown. They were running on my YouTube browser. I mean, they were running everywhere because, quite frankly, he had the money to do so. She did something different. And so rather than take on the money by fighting it with more money, she went a grassroots way. She ignored the polls, and the campaign was very adamant that these polls were wrong. The polls that were showing David Trone ahead by 15 points, 7 points, 9 points, 12 points. The only poll that showed her winning said she would win by 3, and that was a week before the election by The Hill and Emerson College. And then another poll came out that said it was closer than 3 points, that it was a 1-point advantage for Angela Alsobrooks. But ultimately, it was 12 points. Ultimately, it was a larger margin. And she did this correctly, not by spending money on the race, but by organizing on the ground, driving up her margins in regions of the state that David Trone simply did not have the same appeal to and did not have the same campaign strategy to. I mean, you could have seen it here, and I know most of you guys are probably not in the state of Maryland, but you could see that the energy for Angela Alsobrooks was palpable, right? The enthusiasm for her really came in with the Democratic establishment, which we will talk about in just a moment, but it was the campaign's way of battling excessive amounts of funds. And so what we find here is that in areas like Prince George's County and Anne Arundel and Howard and Baltimore City and Baltimore County and Montgomery County, Charles County, St. Mary's County, This is where Angela Alsobrooks, the campaign was really centered around the DC and Baltimore metro areas, and they did very well. Another thing that they did very well that I'm sure everyone can admit helped them tremendously was their association and list of endorsements that she got versus the endorsements that he got. When you take a look at the endorsements that David Trone received, you found that, sure, a whole number of labor unions. He actually did better than her amongst labor unions and also received an endorsement from the Maryland State Education Association. So he was education endorsed, teachers union endorsed. He also was endorsed by a few people. Anthony Brown, the Attorney General, a representative from Maryland's 2nd District, John Delaney, Hakeem Jeffries. So some names you recognize and some names you don't. Some people from Prince George's County, Angela Alsobrooks' home county, Aisha Braveboy. That was a very surprising endorsement for David Trone. But she cleared him when it came down to overall endorsements. At the beginning, she has the Washington Post, Governor Wes Moore, Lieutenant Governor Aruna Miller, Senator Chris Van Hollen from none other than Maryland, Senator Patty Murray, Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, LaFonza Butler, Chris Murphy, Raphael Warnock. Then comes in the entirety of the Maryland congressional delegation with the exception of the 2nd District. Maryland's 3rd, Maryland's 4th, Maryland's 5th, Maryland's 7th, Maryland's 8th. Jamie Raskin, his name should ring a bell. Steny Hoyer, his name should ring a bell. All these people here, so influential, and especially in states like Maryland. Even outside representatives, people like Barbara Lee, people like Jasmine Crockett, people like Maxwell Frost. Then statewide elected officials, Maryland Comptroller Brooke Learman, Mayor of the City of Baltimore, county executives from Howard County, Montgomery County, Baltimore County, Charles County, Anne Arundel County. She got a whole number of endorsements. The state Senate delegation backed her. The state delegate delegation backed her as well, and everywhere across the state, mayors, etc., etc., etc. And so all across the state, she received a significant number of endorsements, but a lot of people wrote it off because David Trone had the money. Now that she won the race, people are starting to realize that a lot more comes into play than simply just what we expect from the polls and what we expect from money. We do know that in 90% of congressional races, the candidate with the most money ends up winning. But in instances like these, it doesn't always happen. The Alsobrooks campaign serves as a blueprint for what many Democrats can do in their safe districts, in their safe states, to take on candidates with excessive amounts of funds. They run a grassroots campaign. They get organized and associated with local leaders here to use their influence on their behalf. Governor Wes Moore, Chris Van Hollen, Lieutenant Governor Aruna Miller, Steny Hoyer, all of these people made advertisements for Angela Alsobrooks, and that $5 to $7 million was used in the final 2 weeks of the campaign season. And they captured a whole number of people, they brought in a whole number of people to this winning electorate for Angela Alsobrooks, and it set polling data on fire because it was the last minute momentum. It was the idea that David Trone had it in the bag until he didn't that allowed Angela Alsobrooks to win. And so now it's about the general election. I spent a lot of this video talking about the Democratic primary, and we'll talk about the general election a little bit later down the line. I don't think it deserves an entire video right now, and we'll talk about it in the next coming months. But now we're moving to the general election. But based on what we've seen in this Democratic primary, I don't know how much I believe it when I see articles like this one, especially after a primary like last evening's. For instance, saying that Larry Hogan, the former Republican governor across the state, leads both Democrats. In this case, this is when both candidates were in the race, but now leads Angela Alsobrooks by double digits across the state. I don't know if I buy that, and I don't know if anybody else really should. While he is ahead up on average, the most recent poll from the Hill and Emerson College looks a lot more likely to what we will see on Election Day, with Angela Alsobrooks ahead by 10 points. Because this is the matchup. Maryland is a Democratic state. And I'm calling it now, and I'm going to say this with full honesty. Maryland is not going to get any more competitive than being a likely Democratic state. At most, for Republicans. This pipe dream here that Democrats are going to lose Maryland because Governor Larry Hogan is deciding to run is a very similar story that Democrats tried to sell their donors and constituents on in 2018 when they said that Phil Bredesen was going to win, that Steve Bullock was going to win in 2020. Neither of this happened. Neither of these situations happened because that's not how states vote. An individualized, localized gubernatorial race where your influence extends only to the boundary of the state is very different than a nationalized seat like one that Larry Hogan is pursuing. And so when you're running in a state like this, especially on a presidential margin, there is no reality in which Biden wins by 33. I'm going to say it again. There's no reality in which Biden wins by 33 and Hogan wins by 10 points. There is no reality that Biden wins the state by 33 points and Hogan wins, full stop. This is where we are going to be, at least in Maryland. It is going to be a state that leans blue, becomes likely blue, and ends up never even being out of the realm of consideration for a Democratic victory. That's where we are. Angela Alsobrooks, I'm telling you now, will be the next U.S. Senator from the state of Maryland. There is quite literally nothing that is going to stop that from happening, including a former Republican governor. And the reason for that is because Maryland is a blue state. When Larry Hogan has to take more nationalized stances, and we'll talk about this when we do analysis on this race in 2 to 3 months from now, where he can't commit to being pro-choice because he turns off his electorate. You already see Republicans defecting from him in a primary where Republicans cleared the field. Donald Trump had no influence in the race. Robin Ficker here received no support from quite literally anyone across the state. And 30% of Republicans said, I don't want the former governor who flipped a blue state red because they don't like him. He's not a Republican to them. And can you imagine him trying to turn them out in the general election? Sure, the race will be closer on the Senate side than the presidential, but in no reality does he win it. And last night's primary, not only for Angela Alsobrooks, proved that she can win in the areas that Democrats need the most amount of support, but also that Larry Hogan simply cannot. And so we will see that come November 6th, 2024, and come January 2025, Angela Alsobrooks will be sworn in as the next senator from the state of Maryland. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.